Out on the edge of nowhere, where the sky is bigger than memory and the wind tells stories the mountains are too old to remember, a woman stepped off a train. Her name was Eleanor Finch. She was 51 years old, not young anymore, not quite old yet, but with the kind of lines around her eyes that life carves when it's taken more than it's given. In one hand, she held a worn leather satchel containing everything she owned in the world. In the other, she clutched a letter. That letter was a promise, a lifeline. It was from a man named Elijah Rowe, a rancher from a place called Willow Creek, a widower. His handwriting was rough, the letters thick and clumsy, but his words had been a balm on a wound she thought would never heal. He wrote that he was tired, that he needed a helpmate, a partner. He didn't ask for a beauty queen or a blushing young bride. He just asked for someone kind. Eleanor had packed up what was left of her life in Indiana, a life where people only saw her as the woman left behind, and bought a one-way ticket west. She was done being invisible. She was ready for a shared supper, a roof over her head, and maybe, just maybe, someone to ask how her day had gone. She wasn't looking for a fairy tale. She was just looking for a place to land. But when the wagon finally rattled to a stop at the address from the letter, her heart fell right through the floorboards. The cabin was gone. Not just damaged. Gone. A heap of splintered timber and blackened stone, crushed into the mud like a giant had stepped on it. The barn was still standing, barely, but the house was a grave. An avalanche, it looked like. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine sap and something else. Despair. There was no Elijah waiting on the porch, no welcome party, just silence. And then she saw them, peeking through the slats of the barn door. 7 pairs of eyes, children, dirty, hollow-cheeked, and staring at her like she was a ghost. The oldest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 13, stood in front of the others like a little soldier. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The letter had mentioned children. It had not mentioned 7 of them. It had not mentioned this. She took a step forward, her boots sinking into the cold mud. "I'm Eleanor Finch," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm here to see Mr. Elijah Rowe." The boy's face was a stone mask. He didn't say a word. He just pointed. He pointed to a small rise behind the ruined cabin. There, half buried in the last of the winter snow, was a simple wooden cross, a fresh mound of dirt, and on the cross, carved into the wood with a shaky hand, was a name: Elijah Rowe. The man she'd crossed a continent to marry was dead. The promise in her hand had turned to ash. Most women would have turned around right then and there. They would have walked away from the ruin, the orphans, the fresh grave, and never looked back. Who could blame them? But Eleanor Finch didn't move. She looked at the 7 pairs of eyes staring out from the darkness of the barn. 7 hungry, terrified reasons to run. And then she did something strange. She walked past the grave, straight to the barn door, and slid it open. "Well," she said, her voice quiet but firm, pulling off her traveling gloves, "I suppose the first thing to do is boil some water." She had come looking for a husband. Instead, she'd found a funeral. And in the shadows of that barn, surrounded by the silent, watching children of a dead man, she felt a cold dread creep up her spine. Because something was wrong here. Terribly wrong. The grave was fresh, yes. But the children's fear, that felt much, much older. For 3 days, Eleanor worked like a woman possessed. She wasn't a bride, not a wife, not even a guest. She was a force of nature. She hauled water from a half-frozen creek, her hands raw and bleeding. She dug through the wreckage of the cabin, pulling out anything she could save. A bent skillet, a few tin plates, a stack of damp blankets that smelled of wood smoke and sorrow. The children watched her. They never spoke. They moved like little ghosts, their eyes following her every move. The oldest boy, Samuel, kept his arms crossed, a permanent scowl on his face. The youngest, a tiny girl with big dark eyes, who couldn't be more than 4, just stared, a hollowed-out doll clutched in her fist. Eleanor found a small sack of flour in the barn, miraculously dry. She stretched it with water and a pinch of salt, making thin, tough biscuits over a fire she built herself. As she handed them out, the children snatched them from her hands and scurried back into the shadows to eat, like feral cats. She was an intruder, a stranger in their grief. On the third night, after the little ones had finally cried themselves to sleep in a huddle of blankets, Eleanor sat by the dying fire. The quiet was deafening. She was alone, 1,000 miles from everything she'd ever known, surrounded by orphans in a land that felt determined to swallow her whole. She pulled out the letters Elijah had sent her. She needed to remember the man, the promise that had brought her here. She read his simple, honest words. I am a plain man, Mrs. Finch. My hands are calloused, but my heart is true. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to shed. She had to be strong for these children. Driven by a restless grief, she decided to salvage one last thing from the cabin ruin. There was an old sea chest crushed under a heavy beam. It probably held nothing but ruined clothes, but she needed to do something. With a piece of splintered wood as a lever, she strained, grunting with effort, until the beam finally shifted. The chest lid popped open. Inside were clothes, just as she'd expected. But tucked underneath a folded shirt was a small leather-bound box. It wasn't locked. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. It was filled with letters. But these weren't his letters to her. The handwriting was the same, but the paper was finer, the ink darker, and the words made her blood run cold. They were love letters, passionate, poetic letters, filled with promises of a beautiful future, of a home filled with laughter. They spoke of a shared dream, of a love that could conquer any hardship. But they weren't addressed to Eleanor Finch. They were addressed to a woman named Clara. And there was more. Tucked into the very last envelope was a photograph. A smiling, handsome Elijah stood with his arm around a woman. She was young, beautiful, with bright eyes and a cascade of dark hair. It was Clara, the woman he truly wanted. Eleanor sank back on her heels, the cold mud seeping through her dress. It all clicked into place. The simple, plain letters he'd sent her, they were an afterthought, a business transaction. He hadn't been looking for a kind heart. He'd been looking for a workhorse, a governess for his 7 children, a plain, older woman who wouldn't ask for poetry or passion. She was the backup plan, the sensible choice, the consolation prize. The man in the grave hadn't just died. He had lied to her from the very beginning. The grief in her chest curdled into a hot, bitter anger. She hadn't just come to a tragedy. She had walked straight into a deception. And as she stared at the smiling faces in the photograph, she noticed something else, something that made the hair on her arms stand on end. In the background of the photo, behind the happy couple, was a man, half hidden in shadow, watching them. His face was obscured, but his eyes, even in the faded picture, she could see the cold, possessive glare. A chill had nothing to do with the night air settled deep in her bones. The avalanche that destroyed this home. Maybe it wasn't an accident at all. The discovery of the letters changed everything. The grief Eleanor felt was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She wasn't here because of a broken promise from a dead man. She was here because 7 children were starving. Her pride could wait. Their survival couldn't. She pushed the image of the beautiful Clara from her mind and focused on the work. Her movements became sharper, her voice more commanding. She organized the children, giving them small jobs, fetching wood, sorting salvaged nails, washing potatoes. Samuel resisted, his eyes flashing with defiance. "You're not our mother," he spat one afternoon when she told him to mend a hole in his sister's sock. Eleanor didn't flinch. She looked him square in the eye. "No, I'm not," she said, her voice low and even. "Your mother is gone. Your father is gone. But the hunger in your belly is real, and the winter is not over. Now, are you going to help me, or are you going to watch your sister freeze?" He stared at her for a long moment, his little jaw set, before snatching the needle and thread from her hand. It was a victory, but it felt hollow. The days fell into a grueling routine. But at night, things grew strange. It started small. A stack of firewood she'd cut would be slightly larger in the morning than when she left it. A bucket of water would appear by the barn door, full to the brim. At first, she thought it was Samuel, secretly helping, but he denied it with such genuine confusion that she believed him. Then food began to disappear. Not much, just a biscuit here, a handful of dried beans there, enough to be noticed. The children whispered among themselves, their eyes wide with fear. They spoke of a shadow, a man who watched them from the trees at the edge of the property. The shadow man, the second oldest, a girl named Mary, whispered one night. He comes when the moon is dark. Eleanor told them it was just their grief playing tricks on them. But she started sleeping with a heavy iron skillet by her side. She found herself watching the tree line, her heart pounding at every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. One night, a bitter wind howled around the barn, rattling the loose planks. Eleanor was woken by a sound, a soft, rhythmic thudding. It was coming from the direction of the old root cellar, whose door was half blocked by debris from the avalanche. Her blood turned to ice. It sounded like someone digging. Clutching the skillet, her heart hammering against her ribs, she crept outside. The moon was a sliver in the sky, casting long, dancing shadows. The thudding grew louder as she neared the root cellar. Taking a deep breath, she peered around the edge of the broken foundation. A figure was there, his back to her, working silently with a shovel. A man, gaunt and thin, dressed in rags. The shadow man. Rage, hot and pure, overcame her fear. This was a scavenger, a ghoul, trying to rob the dead. "Get away from here," she yelled, her voice shaking but loud. "This is private property. Get out!" The man froze. He turned around slowly and the moonlight fell across his face. Eleanor's skillet clattered to the ground. Her mind screamed, impossible. It couldn't be. But it was. His face was thinner, etched with desperation and stubbled with a week's worth of beard. His eyes were haunted, filled with a shame so deep it was terrifying. But it was him, the man from the letters, the man from the photograph, the man whose name was carved on the cross just 100 yards away. It was Elijah Rowe, and he was alive. He stared at her, not with shock, but with a look of utter, soul-crushing defeat, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it. He didn't run. He didn't explain. He just stood there, a ghost made of flesh and blood. The questions crashed through Eleanor's mind like a flood. The grave, the children's lies, the avalanche. Why? Why would a father fake his own death and abandon his 7 children to starve in a ruined barn? The man she had come to marry wasn't a tragic victim. He wasn't a liar she could mourn and move on from. He was a monster, a coward who had let his own family believe he was dead. And as she looked into his haunted eyes, she realized the truth was going to be far worse than anything she could have possibly imagined. "You," Eleanor breathed, the word a wisp of smoke in the freezing air. "You're supposed to be dead." Elijah flinched, the shovel slipping from his grasp. "I know," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stared at the frozen ground between them. The shock gave way to a tsunami of fury. "Your children! They think you're dead. They've been mourning you, starving, alone. Samuel dug that grave himself. How could you?" "I had no choice," he choked out, finally looking up. And the raw agony in his eyes gave her a moment's pause. This wasn't the face of a simple coward. It was the face of a man being hunted. He led her away from the barn, his movements stiff and pained, to a small hidden cave dug into the side of a ravine. Inside, a small fire cast flickering shadows on the damp rock walls. This is where he'd been hiding, living like an animal. And then he told her everything. The ranch was failing. He was in debt, deep in debt, to a man in town named Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was more than a banker. He was a shark who smelled blood in the water. He owned the saloon, the general store, half the territory it seemed, and he wanted Elijah's land, the avalanche. It wasn't a natural disaster. "His men," Elijah rasped, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "They set off a charge up the mountain, said it was a warning, a final notice to get off the property. I was supposed to be in the cabin when it hit. He'd been checking a fence line and saw it happen. He'd run back to find his home in ruins. His first thought was that his children were gone. When he found them, terrified but alive in the barn, his relief was quickly replaced by paralyzing fear. Blackwood would be back. He wouldn't stop until he had the deed. So he'd made a desperate, foolish plan. He faked his own death. He told Samuel to lie, to tell everyone he'd been caught in the slide. His logic was twisted by terror. Blackwood wouldn't harm a bunch of worthless orphans. He'd assumed they'd be sent away, and the land would revert to the bank, where he could snap it up cheap and clean. Elijah planned to sneak his children away in the dead of night and disappear. "I've been coming back every night," he said, his voice cracking, "leaving what food I can hunt, watching, making sure they were safe." Eleanor stared at him, the pieces clicking together. The extra firewood, the missing biscuits, the shadow man. It was him, a father pretending to be a ghost to protect his family. It was a terrible plan, a coward's plan. But it wasn't the plan of a monster. "Why the debt?" she asked, her voice softer now. "Why would Blackwood go to such lengths for a failing ranch?" Elijah's gaze fell to the fire. "My wife, Sarah. She was sick for a long time. The doctors in town couldn't help. I heard about an experimental treatment back east. Expensive. I didn't have the money. Blackwood was the only one who would give me a loan." He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "He knew I was desperate. The interest rates, they were criminal. The medicine didn't work. She died, and I was left with a debt I could never repay." So that was it. A grieving husband trying to save his wife, now trapped by a ruthless predator. But then Eleanor's mind flashed to the photograph. The other woman, Clara. "And the letters?" she asked, her voice hardening again. "The letters to Clara?" Elijah looked up, his face a mask of confusion. "What letters?" Eleanor's heart pounded. She described the box, the passionate words, the photograph. He just shook his head, looking more lost than ever. I don't know any Clara. I've never written a letter to anyone by that name. My Sarah, she was the only woman I ever loved." A new, more sinister chill snaked its way down Eleanor's spine. If Elijah didn't write those letters, who did? And why were they in his house? He then revealed the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle. The real reason Blackwood wanted the land. "It's not for the grazing," Elijah said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's the creek. Old man Hemlock panned a nugget out of it 30 years ago, the size of a man's thumb. He never found another, but the rumor never died. A rumor of gold. Blackwood thinks this land is sitting on a fortune." Now she understood. This wasn't just about debt. It was about greed, obsession, and a powerful man who would kill to get what he wanted. A man who currently thought his only obstacle, Elijah Rowe, was dead and buried. They were living on top of a secret that could get them all killed. And Silas Blackwood was a patient man. He was just waiting for the orphans and the strange mail-order bride to give up and leave. He had no idea who he was dealing with. A new silent agreement was forged in that hidden cave. Elijah had to remain dead. The world could not know he was alive. Eleanor would be the face of the Rowe homestead, the stubborn, grieving widow-to-be who, out of foolish loyalty or sheer grit, had decided to stay and raise the 7 orphans. It was a dangerous, impossible lie. Elijah would live in the woods, a ghost guarding his own home. He would hunt, chop wood, and do repairs under the cover of darkness, while Eleanor and the children maintained the facade by day. Samuel was brought into the secret. The boy's face, upon seeing his father alive, was a heartbreaking storm of relief, joy, and anger. But he understood the stakes. He became their silent co-conspirator. The first order of business was supplies. The flour was gone, the salt was gone, and 7 growing children were a constant, aching demand for food. Eleanor had to go to town, to Willow Creek, to Silas Blackwood's town. She rode in on the family's old, swayback mare, her back straight, her face set like stone. The town was little more than a muddy street lined with wooden storefronts, all of them bearing a small, neat sign. A Blackwood property. At the far end of the street stood the largest building, the saloon, with Blackwood's name emblazoned above the door. Inside the general store, also owned by Blackwood, the whispers started the moment she walked in. She was the mail-order bride, the one who arrived to find a grave, the fool who stayed. She ignored them, her voice calm and clear as she ordered flour, beans, and salted pork. As the storekeeper was weighing the beans, the door creaked open and a shadow fell across the floor. A tall man in a tailored black coat stepped inside. He moved with the easy, predatory grace of a wolf. His face was handsome, his smile was charming, but his eyes were as cold and dead as river stones. It was Silas Blackwood. "Mrs. Finch, I presume?" he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. He swept his hat from his head. "Silas Blackwood. I was so terribly sorry to hear of your and Elijah's misfortune. A true tragedy." "It was," Eleanor said, her voice flat. She refused to give him an inch. "A woman alone, with 7 children not her own. This is a hard country, Mrs. Finch. It has a way of breaking even the strongest of men." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. "I knew Elijah. I considered him a friend. For his sake, I would be willing to take the land off your hands, give you a fair price, enough to get you and the children back east, where you belong." His fair price was an insult, barely enough to cover the cost of her train ticket. Eleanor looked him directly in the eye. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Blackwood, but my place is here now. The children need me. We'll manage." Blackwood's smile tightened. It didn't reach his eyes. "Very admirable," he purred. "But admirable doesn't fill bellies. Do reconsider. My offer stands." He tipped his hat and walked out, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. The message was clear. Get out. The threat was delivered 2 nights later. Eleanor was woken by a scream. She burst out of the barn to see the small hayloft they'd built glowing orange against the night sky. Fire. They worked frantically, a desperate bucket brigade. Eleanor, Elijah, who had appeared from the shadows, and a terrified Samuel, dousing the flames. They managed to save the barn, but the message was as clear as a brand on hide. "We can reach you anytime. We can burn you out." Shaken, Eleanor spent the next day sorting through the last of the salvaged items from the cabin, her mind racing. Tucked inside a small, water-damaged book of poetry, she found it. A hidden diary. The handwriting was delicate, feminine. It was Sarah's, Elijah's late wife. She sat down, her hands trembling, and began to read. Most of it was simple entries about farm life, about her love for her husband and her children. But as she read on, a darker theme emerged, a name that appeared again and again. Silas. Sarah had known Silas Blackwood long before he became their creditor. He had courted her aggressively. He'd showered her with gifts, made grand promises. She had turned him down gently but firmly, choosing the quiet, steady love of Elijah Rowe instead. Blackwood had not taken the rejection well. The diary entries became more fearful. Silas was in town today. He looked at me, not like a man looks at a woman, but like a collector looks at something he means to own. Another entry read, "He offered Elijah the loan. Elijah sees it as a blessing, a chance to save me. But I see the hook inside the bait. Silas does not give gifts. He sets traps." Eleanor's blood ran cold. This wasn't about gold. This wasn't about a business deal. This was a vendetta. Blackwood wasn't trying to get Elijah off the land. He was trying to systematically destroy everything the man he hated had ever loved. He wanted to salt the earth of Elijah's entire life, and Eleanor and the 7 children were the last harvest. And hidden deep within the diary, on the very last page, was a secret that changed everything. A secret Sarah had died with. It was a crude, hand-drawn map, tucked into a flap in the leather cover. It showed the creek, a large rock formation, and a small X, and beside it, a single cryptic sentence. "Not gold. Something better. My family's only way out." The diary changed the game. They weren't just victims. They were guardians of a secret. But a secret was no defense against a man like Blackwood. Eleanor knew they couldn't fight him alone. They needed the law. Against Elijah's bitter protests, "The law in this town wears a Blackwood brand," he warned. She rode back to Willow Creek. She went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was an older man with a weary face and a drooping mustache. He listened patiently as Eleanor, choosing her words carefully, explained the situation. She didn't mention Elijah was alive. She was just a lone woman trying to protect her adopted family, being threatened by a powerful man. She told him about the fire, about Blackwood's thinly veiled threats. Brody sighed, polishing a tin badge with his thumb. "Ma'am, he said, his voice full of practiced sympathy. I hear you, I truly do. But Silas Blackwood, he's a pillar of this community. He owns most of it. You have no proof this fire was anything but an accident. His offer to buy your land sounds generous under the circumstances. Generous? Eleanor shot back, her voice rising. It's a threat. It's a way out, Brody countered, his eyes flat and unreadable. Take the money, ma'am. Take the children and go. There's nothing for you here but trouble. I can't protect you from what I can't prove. Defeated, she rode back to the homestead, the sheriff's empty words echoing in her ears. Elijah had been right. They were utterly, completely alone. That night, as they sat around the fire, the atmosphere was bleak. Hope was a dwindling resource. It was Samuel who broke the silence. He'd been quiet all evening, his brow furrowed in concentration. He's lying, the boy said suddenly. Eleanor looked at him. Who's lying, Samuel? Sheriff Brody. The boy's eyes were locked on his father. Pa, do you remember the day before the slide, when you went to town to sell the calf? Elijah nodded slowly. I was with you, Samuel continued, his voice gaining strength. I was waiting by the stables. I saw Sheriff Brody talking to Mr. Blackwood behind the blacksmith shop. They thought no one was listening. Eleanor leaned forward, her heart starting to beat faster. What did they say, Samuel? Blackwood gave him a pouch of coins, a heavy one, and Brody said, the final payment will be due after the property is clear. And then Blackwood said, don't worry, Sheriff. By this time tomorrow, that land will be swept clean, one way or another. The air went out of the room. It was worse than they thought. Brody wasn't just a powerless, timid lawman. He was a paid accomplice. He was on Blackwood's payroll. He wasn't failing to protect them. He was actively helping Blackwood destroy them. The law wasn't blind. It was bought. They had no allies, no one to turn to. They were surrounded. Just as the last sliver of hope seemed to vanish, they heard it. The sound of a wagon creaking up the long, muddy path to the barn. A visitor. At this hour? Elijah melted back into the shadows, his hand on the hilt of his hunting knife. Eleanor and Samuel exchanged a terrified glance. Had Blackwood sent his men to finish the job? Eleanor grabbed the heavy iron rifle they kept by the door and stepped outside, positioning herself in the doorway. Who's there? She called out, her voice hard. A woman's voice answered from the driver's seat of the wagon. I'm looking for Mr. Elijah Rowe. My name is Clara Blevins. He sent for me. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She stared at the woman silhouetted against the moonlight. She was young, beautiful, and dressed in fine city clothes. It was the woman from the photograph, the real mail-order bride. And she had just walked into the middle of a war zone, looking for a man who was supposed to be dead. The lie they had so carefully constructed was about to come crashing down around them. Clara Blevins stared at the ruin of the house, her pretty face a canvas of disbelief and horror. Eleanor stood before her, the heavy rifle still held loosely in her hands, watching the city woman process the devastation. But the letter, Clara stammered, holding up an envelope of fine cream-colored paper. He said he had a home. He was waiting for me. The carefully constructed lie had to be told once more. There was an avalanche, Eleanor said, her voice devoid of emotion. 2 weeks ago, Elijah, he didn't make it. She pointed toward the wooden cross on the hill. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes welling with genuine tears. Oh, no. Oh, the poor man. She looked from the grave to the barn, and then at the 7 silent children who had gathered behind Eleanor. Her expression shifted from grief to a sharp, calculating intelligence. And you are, she asked, her gaze sweeping over Eleanor's worn dress and calloused hands. Eleanor Finch, a neighbor. It was the best lie she could come up with on the spot. Clara's eyes narrowed. She wasn't buying it, not for a second. She stepped down from the wagon, her movements graceful despite the mud. I see, she said, her voice dropping. Well, I suppose I've had a very long journey for nothing. That night, they gave Clara a space in the barn. She was quiet, reserved, but her eyes missed nothing. She saw the scarcity of the food, the threadbare blankets, the fear that clung to the children like wood smoke. She saw the way Samuel looked at Eleanor, not with the deference one gives a neighbor, but with the shared tension of a co-conspirator. The next morning, Clara found Eleanor by the creek, washing clothes on a rock. "You're not a neighbor, are you, Mrs. Finch?" Clara said, her tone direct. "I saw the letters in your satchel last night. The ones Elijah wrote you. The ones on cheap paper with the clumsy handwriting." Eleanor froze. "You went through my things?" "I'm a journalist," Clara said, ignoring the accusation. "I answer advertisements like Elijah's for a series I write back in Chicago. The Plight of the Prairie Bride. Usually it's a story of disappointment and hardship. But Elijah's letters, they felt different, honest, simple." She paused. "The letters I received, the ones that brought me here, they were different too. They were poetic, eloquent. They spoke of art and literature. They were written by a man of education." She looked Eleanor straight in the eye. Two sets of letters, from the same man to two different women. It doesn't add up, and neither does a healthy mountain suddenly deciding to fall on his house. She knew. She didn't know how, but she knew something was deeply wrong. Eleanor had a choice. Trust this stranger or send her away. But sending her away would be a death sentence. Blackwood would surely see her as a loose end. And looking into Clara's intelligent, determined eyes, Eleanor saw not a rival, but a potential weapon, a powerful one. She led Clara to the hidden cave. The reunion between the ghost and the woman he'd supposedly wooed was a tense, awkward affair. Elijah stared at Clara, a woman he'd never seen before, and she stared back at the man whose beautiful words had captured her imagination. "I never wrote you any letters," Elijah said bluntly. "Then who did?" Clara demanded. They laid the two sets of letters side by side on a flat rock. Elijah's to Eleanor were simple, direct. The ones to Clara were elaborate, filled with turns of phrase a simple rancher would never use. And then Eleanor saw it, a single looping S in the signature of the letters to Clara. An elegant, flourish-filled letter that was completely different from Elijah's own writing. She'd seen that same S before, on the signs all over town, on the door of the saloon. It was Silas Blackwood's signature. The trap wasn't just the loan. It was a web of deceit so intricate it was breathtaking. Blackwood hadn't just intended to ruin Elijah financially. He had concocted a phantom romance, luring a beautiful woman from the city to the homestead. For what? To witness the destruction? To be another pawn in his cruel game? Or perhaps, to be his prize after Elijah was out of the way? Clara's face paled, then hardened with journalistic fury. "The man is a monster. He's not just a thief, he's a puppet master." She looked from Eleanor to Elijah. "I came here for a story, and I found a much bigger one than I ever imagined." A new audacious plan began to form. Blackwood thought he was pulling all the strings. It was time to pull back. Clara would not be the fleeing journalist. She would play the part Blackwood had unknowingly written for her. She would be the wealthy, sophisticated city woman, intrigued by the West and utterly charmed by its most powerful man. She would get close to Silas Blackwood, flatter him, seduce him if she had to. Her mission, to find the original loan document Sarah had signed, or rather the one Blackwood had likely forged. It was their only chance. But it meant sending this woman straight into the lion's den, armed with nothing but her wits. For the first time in the cold, damp cave, the three of them, the ghost, the spinster, and the journalist, became a team. An army of three against an empire of one. While Clara played the part of a hawk circling its prey in town, life at the homestead took on a new rhythm. With Elijah's secret help, they were not just surviving, they were rebuilding. In a secluded hollow, hidden from the main path, they began constructing a new, smaller cabin. It was hard, backbreaking work, but it was work done together. Eleanor had never felt so alive. She was no longer a woman waiting for her life to begin. She was in the thick of it, fighting for a family she had accidentally stumbled into. She saw a new side of Elijah, too. The fear in his eyes was replaced by a grim determination. He was no longer a ghost. He was a father, a builder, a protector. The children began to heal. The presence of their father, even in secret, worked a quiet magic. Laughter, A sound Eleanor hadn't heard since her arrival began to echo in the woods. One afternoon, as Eleanor was stitching a patch onto a small pair of trousers, the youngest girl, Lily, who hadn't spoken a single word since the avalanche, walked up to her, holding a wildflower. She placed the flower in Eleanor's lap and whispered a single, life-altering word. Mama. Eleanor's breath hitched. Tears she didn't know she'd been holding back streamed down her face. She pulled the little girl into a fierce hug. In that moment, she knew. This wasn't just a place she was staying. This was home. Meanwhile, in town, Clara was a smashing success. She presented herself as a wealthy heiress from Chicago, looking to invest her family's fortune in the untamed West. Silas Blackwood was instantly smitten. He saw in her everything he craved: beauty, class, and the approval of the Eastern society that looked down on men like him. He gave her tours of his town, showed off his businesses, and boasted of his power. Clara played her role to perfection, hanging on his every word, her eyes wide with feigned admiration. "You've built an empire here, Mr. Blackwood," she'd say, her voice like honey. "An empire needs an empress," he'd reply, his eyes glittering with possessive desire. She finally earned an invitation to his private office, a room lavishly decorated with mahogany and leather. And there on the wall was a large, ornate safe. "My vault," he said with a proud puff of his chest, "holds all the secrets of Willow Creek." Clara's heart hammered. The loan document had to be in there. She worked on him for another week before she got her chance. During a lavish dinner he hosted for her, she pretended to be fascinated by the intricacies of his financial dealings. Flattered and more than a little drunk on whiskey and his own ego, Blackwood opened the safe to show her the deed to the town's main hotel. "It's all about leverage, my dear," he slurred, pulling out a thick ledger. While his back was turned, her eyes scanned the contents of the safe. And there it was, a file labeled Row E. She needed a reason, a distraction. "Oh, Silas," she said, feigning a slight dizziness. "The journey, the excitement. I feel a little faint. Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" As he turned to bark an order at his housekeeper, Clara's hand darted out. She couldn't take the whole file, but she managed to slip the single, folded document from the top of the pile and conceal it in her sleeve. Later that night, she rode like the wind back to the homestead. By the light of a flickering lantern in the hidden cave, the three of them unfolded the paper. It was the loan agreement, and it was worse than they could have possibly imagined. The amount was triple what Elijah remembered. The terms were predatory, impossible to meet. But the most damning part was the signature at the bottom. Sarah Rowe. Elijah stared at it, his face ashen. "That's not her signature," he whispered, his voice shaking with a rage so profound it was silent. "I'd know her hand anywhere. The loop on the S, the way she crossed her H. This is a forgery, a clumsy one." And then Eleanor saw the date. It was dated 2 days after Sarah had died. He hadn't just trapped a desperate husband. He had committed fraud, desecrating the memory of a dead woman to steal her family's home. They had the proof, the smoking gun. But the document in their hands was useless without the rest of the ledger, without a way to prove it came from that safe. And Blackwood was no fool. He would soon realize it was missing. He would know it was her. Clara's life was now in immediate danger. The clock was ticking. They had to get the entire ledger, and they had to do it now. Their plan was desperate, a long shot stitched together with whispers and prayers. The annual Founders' Day festival was the next night. The entire town would be gathered in the square for music, dancing, and drinking. It was the perfect distraction. The roles were assigned. Clara, their brave queen, would lure Blackwood, the king, to the festival dance. She would keep him occupied, her hand on his arm, her smile a beautiful, deadly mask. Elijah would be the lookout, hidden in the alley across from Blackwood's office, ready to create a diversion if needed. Samuel, small, quick, and light on his feet, would be their burglar. He would slip in through the back office window, which Elijah had painstakingly loosened over 2 nights. His job, open the safe and get the ledger. And Eleanor? She would be in the town square, a mother watching the festivities with the children, ready to create a commotion of her own if the plan went sideways. The night of the festival arrived, thick with tension. The town square was a swirl of lantern light, music, and laughter. But to Eleanor, it felt like a battlefield. She watched as Clara, looking radiant in a dark blue dress, took Blackwood's arm. He was beaming, preening like a peacock. He led her toward the dance platform. The trap was set. Elijah slipped into the shadows of the alley. Samuel, his face pale but determined, scurried behind the saloon and disappeared. Minutes stretched into eternity. Eleanor tried to focus on the children, but her eyes kept darting toward the dark windows of Blackwood's office. Inside that office, Samuel worked in the darkness, his heart pounding. The safe was old. His father, a man who could fix any piece of farm equipment, had taught him how locks and tumblers worked. He turned the dial, his ears straining, listening for the telltale click. Click, clack, click. The heavy door swung open. He grabbed the heavy ledger, his hands shaking with adrenaline. He was just turning to leave when he heard footsteps in the hall. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. He dove behind the desk just as the door swung open. It was Sheriff Brody making his nightly rounds. Brody walked through the office, his lantern casting long shadows. He stopped, his eyes falling on the safe, which was still slightly ajar. Samuel held his breath. From the alley across the street, Elijah saw the light in the office window. He saw the sheriff's silhouette. He had to do something, now. He strode out of the alley and into the saloon. He walked up to the biggest, drunkest man at the bar and shoved him hard. "You spilled my drink," Elijah growled, his face disguised by a low-brimmed hat. The brawl that erupted was instantaneous and violent, spilling out into the street. It was the diversion they needed. Sheriff Brody, hearing the commotion, cursed under his breath and hurried out of the office, leaving the door unlocked. Samuel didn't wait. He grabbed the ledger and scrambled for the window. He was halfway out when another shadow fell over him. A hand like a vice clamped down on his shoulder and yanked him back inside. It was Silas Blackwood. His face was a thundercloud of fury. Clara's distraction had failed. "Looking for this?" Blackwood snarled, snatching the ledger from Samuel's grasp. He shoved the boy against the wall. "Like father, like son, both of you, thieves." Just as Blackwood raised a hand to strike the boy, the office door burst open again. Sheriff Brody stood there, his gun drawn, but he wasn't pointing it at Samuel. He was pointing it directly at Silas Blackwood. "Let the boy go, Silas," Brody said, his voice cold iron. "It's over." Blackwood stared at him, bewildered. "Brody? What is the meaning of this? Do your job." "I am," Brody said, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. "Elijah's wife, Sarah, she was an herbalist. When my daughter took ill with the fever, the doctor gave up on her. Sarah sat with her for 3 days and 3 nights. She saved my little girl's life. I owed her a debt." He gestured with his gun. "I took your money, Silas. I played your game. But I've been waiting for the right moment to pay the debt I truly owe. Now drop it." Blackwood was trapped. The sheriff had turned on him. The boy was a witness. But then he laughed, a chilling, broken sound. "You think this ledger is the only copy?" He hissed, his eyes wild. He lunged for his desk, pulling a small silver pistol from the top drawer. "You think you've won?" The standoff was absolute. Brody had his gun on Blackwood. Blackwood had his on Samuel. It was a deadly triangle. And that's when the office door creaked open one more time. Eleanor stood there, her face pale but her hands steady. She was holding the old heavy frontier rifle, and it was aimed directly at Blackwood's heart. "Get away from my son," she said, and her voice was not the voice of a mail-order bride, or a spinster, or a victim. It was the voice of a mother protecting her child, and it was the most dangerous sound in the world. The tension in the room snapped. Blackwood, momentarily distracted by Eleanor's sudden appearance, glanced toward her. It was the only opening Elijah needed. He burst through the door like a phantom unleashed, a father's protective rage erasing the last trace of the broken man he had been. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself at Blackwood, a guttural roar tearing from his throat. The two men crashed against the heavy mahogany desk. The silver pistol clattered to the floor. Samuel scrambled away as they wrestled, a desperate, thrashing fight for dominance. Blackwood was bigger, but Elijah was fueled by a righteous fury that had been simmering for months. Sheriff Brody held his fire, trying to get a clear shot. Eleanor kept her rifle steady, her eyes locked on the struggle. Blackwood, his face purple with rage, managed to throw Elijah off him. He lunged for the fallen pistol. As his fingers closed around the grip, Elijah kicked out, connecting with Blackwood's hand. The gun went off with a deafening crack. Silas Blackwood cried out, a sharp, ragged sound, and collapsed, clutching his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his fine white shirt. The fight was over. The silence that followed was broken only by Blackwood's pained gasps. Sheriff Brody moved in, kicking the pistol away and binding the wounded man's hands. It was finished. With the ledger as evidence, Brody's testimony, and Clara's meticulously documented story, Silas Blackwood's empire of fear crumbled to dust. The forged loan was nullified. The story of the ghost of Willow Creek and the brave family who took on a tyrant became local legend. Blackwood was sent away to a federal prison, never to be seen in those parts again. Months passed. Spring arrived, washing the land clean. On the Row homestead, a new sturdy cabin stood, filled with the scent of fresh-cut pine and baking bread. The 7 children, once haunted and silent, now filled the air with the chaos of laughter and play. Their wounds were healing. They were a family again. Clara published her explosive story, becoming a celebrated journalist. She found she had a taste for uncovering corruption in the untamed territories and decided to stay, setting up a small newspaper office in Willow Creek. The town, free from Blackwood's shadow, began to breathe again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Eleanor and Elijah stood on the porch of their new home. They watched the children chase fireflies in the twilight. Elijah finally turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet reverence. He reached out and took her hand. His hands were still calloused, but they felt like home. "You know," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "when I wrote that letter to you, I was a broken man, just looking for a pair of hands to help. I asked for someone kind." He squeezed her hand. "But I think you were the answer to a prayer I didn't even know how to speak. You didn't just save my children, you saved me." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, a feeling of profound peace settling over her. She was no longer waiting to be chosen. She was no longer invisible. "We did it together, Elijah," she whispered. "We built this. Not from a letter, not from a promise. We built it from the splinters." She had come west expecting to be someone's bride, but she became something so much more. She became a warrior, a protector, the unshakable heart of a home, forged in fire and truth. She had arrived looking for a place to land, and instead, she had been given a world to build. And it was more beautiful than any promise she could have ever imagined. If this story of courage and resilience touched your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of the quiet heroes who shaped the West. Every family has a story of survival, a moment where someone refused to give up. What was the biggest twist you saw coming in Eleanor's story? And what do you think happened to Sarah's secret, the map that started it all? Let me know your theories in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, stay strong, look for the helpers, and remember that sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones you build from the broken pieces.